heart strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. When my feeble life is o'er, time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to Thy kingdom shore, to Thy shore. Just a closer walk with Thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.
All right, so chapter 26 and verse 34. When Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Why would they bring grief to Isaac and Rebekah?
They weren't as smart. Sorry, Mike.
That's okay.
Making a joke on our early conversation.
Yep.
You know, they didn't see him as right.
Okay, where had Isaac gotten his wife Rebekah? From Abraham. So remember, the servants sent all the way back to the family because Abraham was not going to allow Isaac to take a wife from among the Canaanites where they lived. These were women from among the Canaanites where they lived. These were heathen women. These were idolatrous, not godly people. And there was a reason why Abraham got a wife for Isaac from there. And we're going to see a book into that, hopefully by the time we get to the end of the discussion tonight, if we can get as far as I think we will. And we'll develop this idea some more in just a moment, but it's a really important foundational point to what we're fixing to talk about. And you'll understand why it's a foundational point when we get into it a little bit more. It came about, verse 1 of chapter 27, it came about, and by the way, that's one of the reasons why I think that those verses more accurately connect to this story, because that now it came about is a segue phrase connecting that information to the information that follows. Now it came about when Isaac was old, and his eyes were too dim to see, that he called his older son Esau and said to him, "My son." And he said to him, "Here I am." And Isaac said, "Behold now, I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. Now then, please take your gear and your quiver and your bow and go out to the field and hunt game for me." Now I'm going to stop right there. We're going to look at this. It's a long block. We're going to look at this from chapter 27, 2, all the way to verse 40. That's one big block story. But I want to stop here and talk about the information that we're given here in verse 2 for just a moment. Now I am old, and I do not know the day of my death. All right, so how old was he when he said, "Now I am old"? We don't necessarily know exactly. However, there is a way to get a pretty good estimate of exactly how old he was. And you got to jump forward in order to do it. In chapter 41 and verse 46, we find out that Joseph was introduced to Pharaoh when he was 30 years old. Now, Joseph is Jacob's son. Correct, his lastborn. So, and that does actually come into the timeline. So we know that Joseph was 30 when he was introduced to Pharaoh in Egypt. And when Jacob went to Egypt, he was 39. That included the 7 years of abundance and the 2 years of the famine that had been in place at the time. You'll recall, we don't want to jump ahead too much, but the dreams of Pharaoh and the 7 years of famine and the 7 years of abundance and the 7 years of lean. And so 9 of those years had taken place. So he's 39. And then Joseph, Jacob, was 130 years old, according to Genesis 47 and verse 9, when he came to Egypt at that point in time while Joseph was reigning in Egypt. So he's 130, Jacob is. Consequently, Joseph was born before Jacob was 91, when you do the math. And his birth took place in the 14th year of Jacob's sojourn in Mesopotamia. And that's some things that we're going to be studying about in the future in Genesis chapter 30. Jacob's flight to Laban, which is what we're fixing to read about, it's the very next part of this story, therefore occurred in the 77th year of his life, which makes it the 137th year of Isaac's life. Yeah, I can put something together. I have the verbiage tracking with all the verse citations, but I can put something together and have it to pass out. I'll put it in the foyer. Yeah, there are some timelines out. I did distribute some timelines at the beginning of the class. I'll see if I can find that information as well. But anyway, so he was about 130. There's some discrepancy, and some people have problems with it exactly. Some people say it was 136, that this actually happened a year before. There's no indication of a timeline for that year. It's just kind of makes sense to them, I guess, is the way to say it. There is one source that actually says 117. And his reason for doing that is because if you follow this timeline strictly, then Jacob's 11 children are all born in a 6-year period. And people go, well, that's like impossible. But it's really not, because there was more than one woman. So 6 years is more than possible to have 11 children. So I have no problem with the timeline, and this seems extremely well suited to what we learn over the next 7 or 8 chapters. So I'm comfortable with the idea that he was about 137 years old. Now, the other thing that makes that significant, you may or may not remember this, but that's also the exact age that his brother Ishmael died. We learned about that in chapter 25 and verse 17. Ishmael was 137 years old. So when Isaac got to 137 and his health was starting to fail him, he had become blind at this point, it seems completely reasonable for him to start thinking about mortality. And so that's exactly the way this reads. Behold, now I'm old and I do not know the day of my death. Okay, so he's not saying, hey, I know I'm going to die soon. He's like saying, okay, I'm getting old, I'm losing my sight, I'm not healthy. I could die any day. And so I'm going to go ahead and do what I'm fixing to do now. In hindsight, guess what we find out? He lives to be 180. So we've really got a lot of years actually before Isaac dies. We don't hear a whole lot more about his story, but there's a lot of years that pass before he actually dies. And so this didn't necessarily have to be done immediately from his death standpoint, but he has gotten to that point. His health is failing him enough. He's old enough. He thinks it's within the realm of possibility of dying. So he determines, this is the time that I'm going to bless. And he's
coming back and getting like shots every month. A doctor thinks it'll come back to acceptable or normal, but it messes with your head. Like,
yep.
There's eyes are connected to your brain. You start not seeing stuff that's there.
It scares you.
And so.
And you start realizing that you're getting old. Listen, it's a big step when people have to start wearing reading glasses even. Or when they go to the eye doctor and they say, hey, you know what? My eyes are fine. I'm seeing okay, but, I'm having to take my glasses off to read. Oh, you just need bifocals. How old are you now? Oh, you're just about that time. And you go, what? So that's kind of his state of mind. And I think we are in a room full of people who kind of appreciate, and for those that aren't old enough to appreciate it, your parents are. And so that's kind of what's going on. Now, there are some things that I want to say. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's why I brought that up, because that's also in your mind. By the way, that also happens with your parents. For men especially, when they get to the age that their father was when their father died, they start going, I presume women do the same thing. I'm happy because my dad's still alive, so I'm hoping he makes it to like 150, and then anyway, a couple of things I want to talk about before we get into this block. As we consider this story, there are some things we want to be mindful of, because what is very clear from what I've read up to this point is that Isaac's getting old. He's lost his sight. He calls his son in, his oldest son, which is the one that he prefers, and he says, go do this because I want to bless you. We know from chapter 25 and verse 38, and we can flip back there real quick and read it. It was a few weeks ago, chapter 25, verse 38. At least that's what I wrote down. Must be the wrong. Got to be chapter 24 and verse 38. Nope. Anyway, Isaac preferred Esau. It's a discuss. Maybe it's verse 8 or verse 18 or something. Maybe I picked the wrong number. Somebody can find that. I actually threw these notes together pretty quick, and I may have just transposed some numbers or something. But 28. Okay, thank you. 25 verse 28. Thank you. Yep, I just put 38 instead of 28. And Rebekah loved Jacob. So Isaac chose Esau, and Rebekah chose Jacob. That comes into play in why he chooses Esau. Especially when you consider the fact, go back to verse 23. This one I know is right. Go back to verse 23. The Lord said to her, he's talking to Rebekah about the children, which, by the way, she didn't realize she had twins at the time. But the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people shall be separated from your body, and 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. The older shall serve the younger. That's very important. Who's the older? Esau. And by the way, notice that the text points that out. He called his older, verse 1, he called his older son Esau. So we have this prophecy from God that Esau is actually going to serve Jacob. But Isaac don't care about that. We also know from chapter 25 and verse 34 that Esau despised his birthright. That's what we studied last time. And traded his birthright for a bowl of lentils. That should have come to bear. Whether Isaac knew about that. This blessing should be connected to the birthright. But Isaac don't care about that because Esau is his favorite. Esau is the one that he wants to bless. We just saw that Esau had made the choice to marry heathen wives, and that had actually already created grief in the family, despite the fact that Abraham's example was to know, we're not going to marry these women, we're going to go back and get family. No, he didn't care about that. Esau didn't care about that. Esau chose his wives from the Canaanite women, and that had already caused problems within the family, and Isaac's not worried about that either. He's ignoring that. You notice there's going to be a long list of things that he's just choosing to ignore. He still wants to give the blessing to Esau. Now, this story is about how it came about that prophecy that we just read from God comes to fruition. And that, in fact, the younger is the one that is served by the older, rather than vice versa. That's what's going on here. Okay, so he says, I'm old, I do not know the day of my death. Please take your gear, your quiver, your bow, go out to the field and hunt game for me. We'll also throw in this piece of information we've already been given. Esau was a hunter and a man of the field. Jacob was a man who dwelled in tents and was, we'll call him bookish.
Relationship-ish.
Yeah. He says, go and hunt and prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love. There's some other piece of information. He prefers Esau. He also likes the food that Esau hunts. And apparently even likes the way that Esau prepares it. Prepare a savory dish for me, such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, so that my soul may bless you before I die. Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game to bring home, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, behold, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, saying, bring me some game and prepare a savory dish for me that I may eat, and bless you in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now therefore, my son, listen to me as I command you. Go now to the flock and bring me 2 choice kids from there, that I may prepare them as a savory dish for your father, such as he loves. You shall bring it to your father that he may eat, so that he may bless you before his death. Now, I'm going to stop there and tell you that this is what we know. What I just read is what we know. Most people spend a lot of time talking about the deception that goes on here. There is no motive that's reflected here. There are two possible motives. Don't know which one's right, but there are two possible motives. Just like I suggested that Isaac was influenced by his preference for Esau, she was very possibly influenced by her preference for Jacob. That is possible. The other possibility is, since how God had told her, the older shall serve the younger, she could actually be trying to carry out the wishes of God. She could see what her husband is doing as being rebelling against God's prophecy, and she's trying to, in her mind, do the right thing. Now, right, nothing says it's not both. That is correct. They are not mutually exclusive. And I'll also add this. This story, interestingly, is completely amoral in its telling. There is no condemnation offered to either side. And by the time we get to the end of it, we're going to read some things about Isaac that look completely the opposite of where this started. So just keep that in mind as we go through the narrative. Somebody's Siri keeps picking up my voice. So Jacob, it says, answered his mother Rebekah, behold, Esau is my brother and is a hairy man, and I'm a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, then I shall be as a deceiver in his sight, and I shall bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. And so he says, well, yeah, but you know what? He's blind, but he's not stupid. And Esau is a lot hairier than me, and if he touches me, he's going to immediately know I'm not Esau. And that may, in fact, make him mad, and he may curse me instead of bless me. His mother said to him, your curse be on me, my son. Only obey my voice and go get them for me. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and his mother made a savory food such as his father loved, and Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her elder son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. Now, why would she do that? We're going to find out in just a minute why she did it. But it's not because he's going to look like Esau to him, because he can't see well enough. There's something else that comes into play. She put the skins of the kids, that is the goats that they had just slaughtered to make the meal, on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck, so that if he touched him, what would he feel? Hair. And by the way, don't think about our little short-haired goats that are domesticated over here. These were longer-haired goats, probably not cashmere goats, but like that, with longer, softer hair, that would have been more human. In fact, one of the people that I consulted in the commentaries that I consulted said that it was actually pretty common to use these skins to replace hair on balding people. In other words, men wore them as toupees. It was a suggestion. Now, whether that's completely accurate or not, I don't know. I didn't have time to trace down and determine whether or not his information was true, but that was what it said. It seems consistent with the idea that whatever kind of goat this was, the hair was able to be confused for the hair that might be growing on the arms and neck of a hairy man. So that's what she did. She also gave the savory food with the bread which she had made to her son Jacob. He came to his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am. Who are you, my son? And Jacob said to his father, I'm Esau, your firstborn. I've done as you told me. Get up, please, sit and eat of my game, that you may bless me. And Isaac said to his son, how is it that you have it so quickly, my son? So the first thing he says is, that didn't take long. And then he said, because the Lord your God had caused it to happen to me. In other words, God favored me. I was successful. Isaac says to Jacob, please come close that I may feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. So again, he's not convinced. So Jacob came close to Isaac, his father. And by the way, we're fixing to also find out why he is so skeptical. Came close to Isaac, his father. He felt him and said, "The voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau." And so it sounded like Jacob. And he was like, well, that was awful quick, because he didn't really believe that it could be Esau. And so when he got the answer, that he got, well, come over here, let me touch you. Now, with the touching and what was said, and actually something else, there's an indication that he smelled like him. There goes Esau's clothes. That they pulled it off. This clearly nearly blind individual says, well, you know what? You don't sound like Esau, but you smell like him and you feel like him, so okay. He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He said, "I am." And so we do get a picture here of his willingness to be deceptive and to tell it. Now, his mom told him to do it. But how old is he at this point? He's like 70. Okay? There's not really an excuse. So he said, "Bring it to me, and I'll eat of my son's game, that I may bless you." And he brought it to him, and he ate, and he also brought him wine, and he drank. And his father Isaac said to him, "Please come close and kiss me, my son." So he came close and kissed him, and when he smelled the smell of his garments, he blessed him and said, okay, so even at this point, he's still a bit skeptical, and he says, "Come over here, let me give you a kiss." And when he did that, he smelled Esau, and that was enough. Okay, so he's felt him, and he smelled of him, and he's ate the food, and he's like, okay, I'll accept your testimony. "See, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed." This is how important that one little detail was of her taking the clothes and putting the clothes on him. "Now may God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and abundance of grain and new wine. May peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers." Now, if this blessing had gone to Esau, then this blessing would be in direct contradiction to the prophecy from God. And that's very important to this story. I'm absolutely convinced of that. This is one of the stories I'm going to tell you for a long, long time I struggled with, because all the deception going on with it. And I'm like, well, how in the world could God use that kind of deceptiveness to... There's something here that's significant. So just be aware of this. That prophecy, when God prophesies, he's speaking about how things will be. He is not controlling people. Okay, he's speaking about, well, he knows the end from the beginning. He knows what's going to happen. That's the first aspect of this. The second aspect of it is faith does come into this story. So don't think that it doesn't. We'll talk about that at the appropriate time. May people serve you. May nations bow down to you. Be master of your brothers. And may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be those who curse you, and blessed be those who bless you. And it came about, as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, Jacob had hardly gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also made savory food and brought it to his father, and he said to his father, "Let my father rise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me." And Isaac his father said to him, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm your son, your firstborn Esau." And Isaac trembled violently. He was not happy. "Who was he then that hunted game and brought it to me, so that I ate of all of it before you came?" And blessed him. "Yes, and he shall be blessed." When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceeding great bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me, even me also, O my father." By the way, this shows the character of Esau. He had no self-control. We'd already saw one picture of that when he came in from a day's work and, "Oh, I'm starving to death, and if I don't eat right now, I'm going to die." And here, he does not control his emotions at all. He is throwing a full temper tantrum. The language here is very strong. He cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry and said, "Well, can't you bless me too?" Just like a spoiled child. He said, "Your brother came deceitfully and has taken away your blessing." Then he said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has supplanted me these 2 times. Now that has reference to the birthright incident, which, by the way, was not all Jacob's fault. Esau was right in the middle of that. But notice he blames Jacob for it. And he says, "Well, you gave him the right name because he's a deceiver. And now this is twice." He says, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Verse 37, Isaac answered and said to Esau, "Behold, I have made him your master." Now, boom, right there. You got to remember that before they were even born, that prophecy from God that says, the older will serve the younger, and go, "Well, wait a minute." That is what God said was going to happen. "Behold, I made him your master, and all his relatives I have given to him as servants, and with grain and new wine I have sustained him. Now, as for you, then, what can I do? I've given him everything. There's not really anything I can do for you." Esau said to his father, "Do you have only one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father." So Esau lifted his voice and wept. And Isaac his father answered and said to him, "Behold, away from the fertility of the earth shall be your dwelling, and away from the dew of the heaven from above, and by your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall come about when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck." I'm going to stop there for just a moment. This is actually, the end of this can be taken as a blessing. He says, you're going to serve your brother, but there's going to be a day that comes along where that servitude's going to be released. All right, here's my question. Why does Isaac seemingly all of a sudden become very comfortable with having been deceived and having given Jacob this blessing?
He accepted his own words.
Okay.
The deal is done.
Okay, he did. He certainly, he said, "You know what, the blessing's given, it's not revocable, it's done, I can't do anything about that." And he did accept that. There is another verse of scripture we want to look at that's very, very important, and when we read it, we're going to probably remember that we've seen it before, but we don't talk about it a whole lot, even when we study this place. Flip over to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that great, wonderful chapter about faith, and read with me verse 20. "By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come." That phrase, "by faith," extremely important. It's defined earlier in this book by, for instance, Noah built the ark by faith. When you go back and read the story of Noah in Genesis, over and over and over again, that says he did everything God commanded him to do. Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So we know how faith is established. We know what faith is. It is the response of man to the things that God has said. And that verse says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. The events that took place that we just read about, the Bible itself says was an act of faith on the part of Isaac. So I'm comfortable saying that God was involved. And one of two things must be true based upon Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 20. Either Isaac realized his desire to bless Esau had disregarded the prophecy that had been made at their birth, and becoming aware and remembering what God had said, he then became comfortable with the blessing that he had given to Jacob. Or God chimed in and spoke to him so that Isaac knew that what he did was the will of God. Because it says that he acted by faith. The only way he could have acted by faith is if he was doing what God said to do. And by the way, you don't accidentally act in faith. Accidentally doing what God wants you to do is not acting by faith. So I am convinced that either the Genesis account just doesn't tell us that God made him aware of it at that moment, or he reflected back upon the prophecy from their birth and he went, you know what? This is what God meant, and this is what needs to be done. And so when his favorite was crying and wailing and begging for something, he was like, can't do it. I can't do it. This is what's happened. This is what must be. Karen, did you have a comment or a question? Right. All right. And did you have a comment, Mike? Okay. Anybody else? So hopefully, if we don't accomplish anything else tonight besides just refreshing ourselves with this story, hopefully we're all more comfortable with understanding that what took place here was God's will, and God was actually controlling things and telling people, this is what I want done. At some level, at some point, and men were responding appropriately. Yes, there was some deception. That does not mean that the deception was pleasing to God. But it does mean that from Isaac's standpoint, Isaac became aware at some point, wait a minute, my desire to bless Esau is not the will of God. And what I did blessing Jacob is the will of God, and that's what I need to do. Yes. It could have been. Right.
Esau deal with, because if Isaac had really been being faithful all along, right, he would have been telling them as they were growing up, Esau, you're my firstborn, and Jacob, you're going to be getting a blessing because that's what God
said. Right. So those very, very good observations. And so
It was Peter that said some of these guys spoke things they didn't understand.
Well,
They're still
yeah,
going to look into it.
exactly. He did talk about the fact that the prophets longed to understand the things that they wrote. Not all the prophets understood. But this is an unfolding in the life of Isaac of him coming to grips with and understanding a prophecy that was made that he may not have fully understood at the beginning.
Christians, we look at some of the prophecies of things God says, y'all will be this way, and you will do these things, and then we go like, okay, well, God's going to make that happen. No. God's telling you, I'm watching you, and in the future,
This is what's going to happen.
this is a template for understanding prophecy. Mike.
You know who's going to make it happen?
You.
People. But knowing the end from the beginning, God can say this is where it's going to end up and still allow men to exercise their free will. Which means that when God prophesied, for instance, that Christ would die on a tree and that these things, that the Christ would suffer at the hands of men, all that stuff he prophesied. When God prophesied that one of his friends would betray him, that doesn't mean that God made those things happen. It simply means that God was aware of what would happen and told us ahead of time, this is what you're going to do. He doesn't always say this is how you're going to do it or why you're going to do it or any of those things. He just simply says, this is what will be. And it does, and it should affect us a whole lot in terms of how we understand and read prophecy.
God jumped in there and told Rebecca while she was pregnant, but she asked.
Yes.
God didn't just say, oh, I need to go down there and check thing. She said, hey, what's that?
Yep.
And she inquired.
She inquired.
And I think it's even one of those examples where God says, like in Romans 8, where the Spirit intercedes for us. Her question really could have been answered differently. God gave her the best answer.
All right, so verse 41. Looking at the clock, I got to stop. Verse 41 is where I'll pick up. You can write that down, and don't let me skip, Miss Karen, because the end of this chapter is somewhat significant as well, and leads into the next discussion, which is an interesting thing because Jacob's actually going to go away, and the reason why Jacob goes away is interesting, and not just the reason why he goes away, but the justification for him going away, which is different than the reason, also is interesting and relates to some of the things that we saw and talked about earlier tonight. And then how long he stays away is quite significant. And so we're going to look at all those things as the story develops, and it's really interesting. And by the way, we're not seeing much of Isaac's life. We're not really going to see much of Jacob's life. But do you want to know what? Through the balance of the Old Testament, when God wants to make a point, he says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So these are men that are central to the story, and yet only a few pictures of their life are actually recorded for us. And that's, to me, is a very interesting thing as well.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story.